Everybody, thank you all for joining us and for staying with us for a few moments. We assembled our panel. Dr. Wright, I hand over the microphone to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Michael. And thank you to all of you for being here. So our topic for this panel today addresses the gender divide and diversity in cybersecurity and digital financial services. And as we know, access to digital financial services can really help build economic power for people around the world who have traditionally not had access to banks or other financial services. This can include women, it can include people in developing countries, it can include people experiencing homelessness, and others. However, these services have not been uniformly adopted, and when adopted, they can give rise to risks of security attacks, cybersecurity attacks on vulnerable populations. Furthermore, both the cybersecurity workforce and the DFS workforce are predominantly male and from wealthy countries. And so this lack of representation at the design and implementation stage can be reflected in cultural assumptions, gender-based assumptions about how the products and services are used that can exacerbate lack of trust in these kinds of solutions, so unwillingness to adopt them, as well as, again, increasing the risk to those who do. So I'm joined today by 4 expert panelists to discuss these interrelated issues. We have Jaya Baloo, Chief Information Security Officer at Avast, Leslie Goh, who is a fellow at Cambridge University and former CTO at World Bank Group, Taylor Grossman, Research Analysis in the Cyber Policy Initiative at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Brencil Kaimba, Head of Product Strategy and Partnership Development at Serianu, and also Membership Director of ISACA Kenya. So to start us off, panelists, I'd like to have each of you talk for a few minutes about your role and how you see issues of gender and diversity arise in your context. And let's start with you, Brencil.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for having me. Sorry about my camera. Sorry about that. Yeah, so yes, my name is Brencil Kaimba, and I'm a product strategy and development lead at Serianu, but I'm also the editor-in-chief of Africa Cybersecurity Report, which is a report that we do every other year in Africa. And we've featured quite a number of countries over the last couple of years. And this is probably where I'd base my my take on gender issues, because throughout my career, I've been fortunate enough to interact with a number of women, and I've seen the issues of gender evolve, particularly around cybersecurity. Even the number of women that are taking up cybersecurity as a career path, but also initiatives that are aimed at encouraging more women to join cybersecurity. I think from my perspective, I've seen it increase. It's not to the level where I'd want it to be, but at least I've seen some positive input towards that. So I'm excited to actually share more about this as we go along. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Taylor.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. And many thanks to Rebecca, Keith, Michael, and the rest of the team for organizing this event. So as I was just introduced, my name is Taylor Grossman, and I'm a researcher at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And for those of you who don't know us, we're an international affairs think tank, and our headquarters are in Washington, D.C., where I'm based, but we also have offices in Beijing, Beirut, Brussels, Moscow, and New Delhi. And so I work on the Cyber Policy Initiative, specifically on the Cyber Project, where my focus is on capacity development and financial inclusion. And so I just wanted to talk briefly about 2 of our projects that are particularly relevant for thinking about diversity in cybersecurity. So the first is our FinCyber Strategy Project. November of last year, we launched a strategy to better protect the financial system, which had 6 primary pillars. And one of those pillars is specifically focused on workforce development. And so we have a couple of different approaches that really look specifically at how to expand the pipeline for new talent, how to improve retention for current talent, and also how to really think more broadly about cybersecurity professionals and how to get sort of more women and more diverse voices in the profession. And the second project that's newer and we've started more recently is our cybersecurity capacity development and financial inclusion project, which actually Keith has been involved in some of our working groups. And that is supported by a grant from the Gates Foundation. And there we're focused much more specifically on low and lower middle income countries and particularly countries on the African continent. And in this project, we're really interested in understanding how the digital transformation of the financial system is unfolding in the developing world. And a key focus here is on gender inclusion and really thinking broadly and creatively about how we can build financial systems that are more open and accessible for the entire population. So I'll stop there, but really would be excited to chat more about any of that in the Q&A. And thanks again, Rebecca.
Great, thank you. And we will definitely explore some of that in more detail in the Q&A. Leslie.
Thank you, Professor Wright. I'm honored to be here and also thank the organizing team, Michael and Keith. Honored to be back. I've been involved in this for the last few years and our in-person experience is fun and exciting, but virtual is what we can do right now and still great to exchange knowledge among the distinguished speakers here. My expertise is in leveraging new frontier technologies such as AI, IoT, blockchain, 5G, cloud, edge computing. And this is to support the scale out of sustainable development goals at the intersection of policy framework and technology. My role is also at the executive roles of a board and in independent boards, and so bring together that dimension of promoting more women in tech and having spent all my life in technology, encouraging young girls and women to pursue STEM education and join the labor force. And related to that point is the fact that the changing skill set of cybersecurity among professionals is in this platform is very important. I advise many governments on the digital transformation journey, especially in the transition to cloud technology. And so there's more agility and cloud adoption is also a mindset shift. But many security professionals today are trained in a traditional hardware security. And the key tenets of on-site security and securing a formidable fortress and having direct control on everything. But in the cloud security world is an anti-pattern of this philosophy. We need to trust the cloud service provider for most of the infrastructure security and focus instead on application security. And it is also transition for those who are trained in the traditional security concept, where security by design is now to be assumed as a breach at any times. And therefore, we need to come up with more agile and adaptable approach for robust solution in this new cybersecurity threats in the times of COVID. And also, the other thing is law enforcement around the world has witnessed such rise in these criminal activities as indicated in the opening remarks earlier. And the phenomenon has made us to rethink the global response, tapping upon the global and regional network to counter cybersecurity. Hence, we have been together on several discussions with Taylor as well on such methods. And I also want to emphasize the fact that the whole operating model needs to be around the detect, protect, response that NIST put together, how we can bring in all that dimensions to make sure that the victim's point of view is also taken into consideration. And what do you do if you're affected by such nefarious actions taken by bad actor to suit their private needs? And any one of us could become a victim of cybercrime. And what happens to us and what do we do? What mechanisms are at our disposal to stop such harmful behavior? What avenues of recourse do those vulnerable in our communities have in this manner, especially for the women and the small, low and middle income countries? These are the questions that keep me up at night. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Jaya, we turn to you.
Yeah, so I'm not going to repeat some of the comments that are made by my earlier distinguished colleagues, but what I do want to say is, let's talk a minute about that last point that Leslie stated about victims. There's no easy way to do comparison of victims of cyber attacks online, but I can tell you that when we start looking, we'll find that the fundamental distribution around that population will be based on access and literacy and digital fluency. If you don't have those, you can bet your bottom dollar that the women who are able to access and participate online will be proportionally more disadvantaged because of this lack of digital literacy and fluency. So, first of all, we've got more than a billion women who don't even have like a mobile phone, who are definitely part of the unbanked. If we start with that problematic, worrying figure, and then we take a look at, okay, so if there are enough good cybersecurity practices, how many of these women are actually deploying those? You'll find that to be significantly worse compared to the men who are participating in the same ecosystem. So that's the first thing which makes it not an equal fair game to start with. The second thing that I'm really worried about is we actually see targeting more often of women than of men. And a really good example is during COVID, we saw an exponential rise in the amount of stalkerware cases. And I'm saying this as the CISO of Avast, which is looking at these attacks on a daily basis. We see women being targeted. And that is, I think, a really worrying trend that we've seen ever since we've been locked in our homes, increase in domestic violence cases, but also increase in stalkerware and malware targeting women.
Yeah. Great, Jaya, thank you. It's really interesting. I feel like at the very beginning of the pandemic, some of what we were seeing kind of online and chatter in some of the the dark groups, as I understand it, was sort of a, don't take advantage, criminals, do your crime, but don't take advantage of the pandemic. And then, whether it was different people or the fact that this was going to be a long time or was a great opportunity, there was really a shift in that culture and a feeling like this is our opportunity as criminals to have access that we did not have before. And I think we've really seen that play out, kind of at all levels. So I'm going to go ahead and ask some questions to the panelists, but participants, please feel free to suggest questions at any time using the Q&A button, and we will certainly get to those as well. So Brencil Kaimba, let me start with a question to you. Are there patterns, and we've already talked about this to some degree, but let's delve more into this, where different groups tend to be more or less susceptible or resistant to cyber attacks, whether it's gender, age, different countries and cultures, education level, and we will discuss in some detail sort of how we can promote people who, to having the information or technologies that they need to become more resistant rather than more susceptible over time. But let's just get that baseline about what kind of patterns we see as groups. Of course, individuals can be different in that kind of susceptibility.
Okay. So allow me to just break it down based on gender, and then we look at age, and then we'll touch on education. So I think like Jaya and even I think Leslie mentioned this, yes, there is a systematic, you'd call it systematic target towards, let's say, women. But it's, I wouldn't want to put it straightforward like that. It's because I'm borrowing from different research that I've read, where when you look at the data that has been researched, there are a lot of women that are particularly scammed when you look at, let's say, online scamming, romance scams. But the perpetrators, majority of them are men. So by the fact that there are a lot more men perpetrating the attack, the victims would definitely be more of women. So in that particular sense, we are seeing a lot of women being more susceptible to online scams. But also just from the fact that even now from the research that we've done in terms of exposure to digital literacy, but also just digital gadgets, the men are more exposed to such platforms at an earlier age. So it's easier for them to either identify or even be aware of such things as compared to ladies who are exposed much later in life. So that is just high level in terms of men versus women. But on the flip side is from even what we have found out, even from the research that we've been doing, is that when I go back and look at the statistics of the gender in terms of reporting of cybercrime, it's actually women who report cybercrime more as compared to men. And that is one of the disparities that I found very interesting when it comes to reporting of cybercrime, for instance. When you look at age, again, just from the dynamics of, we have the millennials, we have Generation Z, we have the older generation. Just, I think by the fact that, and this is borrowing from our research that we are currently doing, we did a while back, but we've not finalized it, is we interviewed a number of campus students, men, women, ladies, gentlemen, and then we wanted to understand how they consume the internet, what they use the internet for, and their level of consumption is way higher as compared to the older generation. So even when you employ the younger generation to work, they tend to be more tech savvy than the people who are supervising them. So in that particular sense, you find that the types of attacks that are leveraged towards the older generation is very different from the type of attacks that we see being leveraged against the younger generation, just from that particular point of view. Another disparity or difference in terms of just vulnerability is, I'll take the example of my mother, for instance. She gets a phone call from a number of people who tell her, you have to share with us your ID number or your PIN or the last person you called, just as a form of scam. So for her, it's something that she has to really think about. But for me, that is something that is very obvious. I already know that is a social engineering scam. So it varies in terms of the types of attacks, but in terms of vulnerability, I think the older generation are more vulnerable. But the younger people are also very much targeted. It's just that the type of attack is very different. When you look at education and culture, one of the things that we found out even from our report, and even just as a continent, basically, when you're going through education or education system, we are not necessarily taught how to detect or prevent crime or cybercrime for that matter. So education level does not really matter. Like, you could be a CEO, you could be someone who is not educated. So that formal education really is not the point. However, the people who have been made more aware or they've been exposed either through experience or through lessons, they are less vulnerable or susceptible to these attacks. This is what we've found. Even just from doing the normal social engineering for employees, you'd find that people who are more exposed to training will be more likely to identify scams or even attacks as compared to the people who are not educated in that particular sense. So that is the differences that I would put across.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Jaya, maybe you want to take this one. So in that context then, how do cybersecurity solutions and design of digital financial services need to take into account social, cultural, educational, and economic factors in order to successfully reduce risk?
I think the biggest thing is, in order to increase that acceptance of digital hygiene, I mean, we talk about what's the right thing to do all the time, right? We always say, hey, don't, just use simple passwords, make sure that they're complex, preferably 3, but this is not always taking into account how people actually behave, and especially bridging those potential divides amongst how people behave. Another really good one is multi-factor authentication. And we're talking not just about gender, but this is also, there are so many schisms here. So when we take a look at who's actually adopting some of these techniques and solutions that we have available, we see that the way that we try to drive the raw technical measure towards implementation, that's really where kind of, the burden of proof or, our ability to actually scale that is lacking. And I think that's where we need to be doing a better job of just educating people, because in average, when we take a look at password behavior, men versus women, in general, women tend to get it more right. There was a study, I believe, last year that said something like, 22% of women have do a better job of doing their passwords correctly and not having simple guessable or not unique passwords, versus like 16% of men or something like this. But the fact of the matter is those numbers are not that great, and you really want to have it much more towards ubiquity than these very low under 25% numbers.
Yeah, great. So coming at this now from the other end, let's talk about the cybersecurity workforce. So Taylor Grossman, a question for you. What is the current status of gender diversity in the cybersecurity workforce in, say, low, middle, and high income countries?
Great. Yeah, thank you. So, I think we're seeing some improvements in the composition of the cybersecurity workforce. So just to start, we look at the United States. The gender gap has been decreasing, but it's still quite sizable. So, women make up about 19% of computer science college graduates in the United States. And only about 25% of sort of computer jobs broadly, but a lot of those are focused in the healthcare industry and not necessarily in the financial system or in other more male-dominated areas. And the gender pay gap is somewhere around 74% in STEM in the US, but about, I think, 80% in the broader workforce. So it's actually more extreme when you look at STEM roles. Worldwide, the stats are about the same. I think there's somewhere around 70% of the cybersecurity personnel workforces globally are male. I think what we've seen is that actually in the past few years, the workforce gap, the gap between how many jobs we have in cybersecurity and how many people we actually have to fill them has been decreasing. Last year was the first year that studies have found that it actually has decreased from, I think, around 4 million to a little over 3 million, sort of as the gap worldwide. And in the US, that's somewhere around 350,000 jobs that are sort of unfilled. But with the pandemic and with how things have really gone much more virtually, we're experiencing still today, the pressures put on that workforce are much more extreme. So just some interesting numbers that I found by a recent report. The largest gap in the workforce is in the Asia Pacific region, but it's still quite sizable in the United States and in the West. But when organizations were asked, how long do they have to actually go remote during the pandemic? Many organizations actually made that switch in just under a week or even in a few days. So 30% of respondents who responded to the survey by ISC actually reported that the organizations did make that switch in a single day. So you can imagine how extreme these cybersecurity vulnerabilities would be if you're going entirely remote and introducing a whole host of new stressors and new vulnerabilities because people are now using their own infrastructure as opposed to the IT infrastructure that was in a physical location. So I think there's quite a few opportunities to really think about actually increasing sort of the pipeline of talent into the workforce. And then now is a really great time to be thinking about this. But it's certainly not where we want to be.
Yeah, thanks. And Leslie Go, turning to you. So as we've just heard, women, as well as some other groups, aren't well represented in the cybersecurity workforce, and for that matter, in the digital financial services workforce, making it sort of a double problem maybe. So why is this a problem? What are the impacts?
Oh, well, I would have to say, in general, the tech sector is male dominated in all the 3 decades that I've been in this space. Not just cybersecurity is a subset of the whole entire tech sector challenge, compounded by the fact that the few girls compared to boys are pursuing STEM education. So I think that's one of the things that we have to look at and teaching, encouraging young girls to code and also look at the technology career as something cool and change that stereotype. In fact, I was recently visited the American History Museum in DC, and there's a whole exhibit on the girlhood and focusing on STEM education. I think that is a right way to change the dialogue and encourage more women to pursue that as a career option. And also the other thing is from the workforce environment, addressing bullying and sexual harassment is important. Emily Chang from Bloomberg published a report, a book recently called Rotopia, talk about the Silicon Valley mindset. There's rather toxic culture and among the male-dominated industry. And we also need to give more recognition to women as entrepreneurs, and helping them, mentoring them, and providing that kind of enabling environments for them to thrive and be successful. I think those are some of the things that I think would be important to encourage more women labor force participation, especially in the cybersecurity space?
Yeah, thanks. As a professor at a women's college who heads the computer science program, I couldn't agree with you more that we just need to, really normalize the idea that these are skills and careers that are available to everyone, especially since they're such great jobs. They pay well. I think they're fun, and the opportunities are everywhere because everything is a tech job, or at least every sector has tech in it. So Leslie, let me turn to you. Taylor, let me turn to you since Leslie addressed this a little bit. What other kinds of initiatives have been or could be implemented to address these workforce gaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think expanding the pipeline is definitely the first place to start. And, I think that the mentorship elements that Leslie mentioned are hugely important. I also think that, one of, there's a lot of sort of untapped resources when we think about actually how to expand the pipeline. There's a lot of focus on creating STEM education and really encouraging it at the college level. But as we look at a lot of cybersecurity roles, it's not entirely clear that they necessarily have to be college or master's degrees actually to fill them. So, in the work that we've done with some financial organizations on our workforce development study, we really found that for a lot of folks, they sort of fall back on college degrees and certifications as a way to, as a litmus test for skills. But what they really value much more is actual real world experience. So that's where I think we can really think about expanding apprenticeship programs, in-house programs, and even community college or high school programs to really start to build out that experience earlier on and get more women, more people of color actually into cybersecurity roles, earlier in their career, and as a pathway that doesn't necessarily necessitate, a bachelor's or a master's degree. And I think, another piece that I'll just mention here and that we found again and again is really focusing also on improving the retention of the current workforce. The statistics are very bad when it comes to women actually leaving the workforce. And then, I think having a hard time re-entering after they've had children or after they've sort of taken some kind of leave of absence based on, some of the demands of being in a two-person household. So, I think remote work has certainly become much more of the norm in the last year or so, accidentally, but I think it's pushing a lot of organizations to think much more creatively about how to make hours more flexible and how to make the work environment more flexible so you can actually allow people to work from anywhere and allow people to work more flexibly. So I'll stop there, but I think there's been some good progress sort of by accident, and it's good to keep that in mind as we continue.
Yeah, great, thanks. And I'm going to drop into the chat as well the URL for a program that I'm involved in, scholarships for women studying information security. That's for undergrads in their later years and master's students, with the idea of getting them to think at that stage about these possible careers. So just dropping that into the chat. And Brencil, let me turn back to you. So focusing on the general population, what kinds of programs are there or could there be to increase cybersecurity skills in the general population, so not necessarily the targeted cybersecurity workforce? And let me bring in a question from the audience as well as part of this. How can governments over the world expand this kind of cyber literacy? And do you know countries, or let me say communities, where this kind of teaching is included in school programs or any other kind of model programs that could be adapted and adopted elsewhere?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. So maybe I can start by saying the initiatives that I know exist, and maybe some of them are very tailored to specific group. For instance, like in Kenya, the public initiatives, we do have our ICT authority that has started a digital program, and part of that is just to help. It's a partnership between public and private sector, whereby they're trained and then they get placement in different institutions. And as you know, just cyber, you need some technical skills at least to boost you, especially if you're going to fall into a technical role. So I think that is one of the initiatives that I've seen that is, it's good. Another public initiative that I've seen again, in Kenya, is there's a cybersecurity training program that the government has set up together with our internal ministries. And again, a number of people, youths, particularly youth, have been flooding there to just get trained, and it has also it also involves other practitioners, so it's an opportunity for practitioners to also engage with the youth. I've seen something similar again in Uganda with the National IT Authority. There are also similar initiatives in Nigeria. The scale is not so big. However, there are these steps that they're taking to ensure that at least, even if it's not specifically cyber, is the first step, technology or digital literacy. We've seen a lot of we've seen a lot of consistency with private firms, the likes of, in Kenya, Safaricom, my organization, Serianu, where there's a lot of, as part of CSR, organizations are going out there to just train the youth on issues cybersecurity or even digital literacy. So I think those are some of the initiatives that already exists within the continent, Africa. But when you look at like the question Patrick asked, the scale and how can they work together? One of the proposals, or one of the propositions I would give, and this is something we are actually working on at the moment, is like Taylor mentioned, when you look at the issue of women involvement or even awareness, yes, you can spend a lot of time doing awareness, but then you have to understand the retention issues that come along with that. From our research in 2018 around women and inclusion in cybersecurity, you find that a lot of women, yes, you'll be enticed into going into cybersecurity, but then statistics show that a lot of women tend to go for GRC roles, governance, risk, compliance roles. So again, having an understanding of these dynamics will just help with fine-tuning this ecosystem, whereby the government is doing its bit in terms of formulating policies and also an enabling environment. And then academia, one of the things that we are currently working on, and we've been working on with academia for the last 6 years, is we work with academia to help embed cybersecurity into their curriculum. And one of the top universities we work with is United States International University Africa, USIU Africa. And what that means is that when a student comes out of school, they're ready for us to have them as an intern or as an employee, which helps bridge that gap, because there's such a big divide between academia and the industry, what the industry wants. So I would say more initiatives like that. And just having that communication between industry, what do we expect as industry? What skills are we looking for? And then academia, are you training them on these particular skills other than the rest of the other skills? So having a framework that can work like that, I think would help. And I do believe that there are specific organizations like our organizations who we are actively seeking to improve this for the sake of enhancing the threat landscape, basically. So that would be my response to that. Thanks.
Yeah, great, thank you. And looking at the Q&A, so Tapua Chinimbiri had a question: how do we measure the specific magnitude of the gender digital divide across these spheres? And Leslie, I see you put an answer that addresses this in the chat that just host and panelists can see. If you're willing to copy this to everyone, Leslie is referring to some research studies that are exactly doing this, and there's a nice paper there that describes those results. And good, I see that's available to everyone. And of course, always more work to do because it's a moving target, and exactly what you're measuring and how much you can trust that data are issues, but at least to try to get some handle. And I believe that report primarily focuses on adoption and usage, not on the workforce side of it, but there are other studies on that. And then I also, this one I think is a comment more than a question, but I want to highlight it because I couldn't agree more. So Alexandra Searle in the Q&A says, in addition to encouraging women by encouraging the pipeline, mentorships, et cetera, one needs to consider other fields that are non-STEM for cybersecurity. I look at additional skills: political science, geopolitics, climate, economics. I even have an architect who is formerly was a CISO in a small organization. It's good to remember that cyber does not need exclusively STEM. It needs more holistic approaches, and that requires a more holistic set of skills and backgrounds. And I would go even farther. I think that's particularly true in cyber, but I think it's increasingly true across the tech sector. And this is something, in my teaching, I both try to teach the students who are majoring in computer science that they should learn some things about other skills and disciplines, and that they should respect the viewpoints and diversity of background and thought across disciplines in order to have better solutions. And then also I try to teach students, as many who will listen to me across the disciplines, that their skills are needed to make a better tech world. And I think that is so true, specifically in cybersecurity, where you need to understand how people behave and how you can change people's behaviors, and what the policy impacts are, and how the questions of, so if passwords, or people choose bad passwords, you can educate them to choose better passwords, or you can make systems that will somehow work even when the passwords are bad, for example. And I see Taylor has her hand raised. So Taylor, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to add, I think that's hugely important, as Rebecca, as you were elaborating, and I think it's a great question, comment. One of the things that we found in our workforce study of financial organizations is that some of those sort of softer or non-technical skills were hugely valuable, thinking about how to actually implement sort of policy across the organization, teamwork, a lot of again, sort of things that you might not get in a classic sort of cybersecurity certification. And I think that's also, links back to what Brencil was talking about, and also Leslie, about thinking about mentorship programs, and also more internships and apprenticeships, because there's a lot that you can learn in the classroom, but the industry expectations and actually sort of what it means to be a cybersecurity professional might be different, and might include a lot of those softer skills. So I think thinking about bridging that gap, and also bringing in folks who come from non-tech backgrounds and integrating them into cybersecurity teams is really important. Speaking as somebody who was a political science major in undergrad, I was really encouraged early on in my career to think about cybersecurity, and really it was stressed to me by some of my first bosses that you can that there's so much additive by having that policy background, and that actually you can learn the tech stuff later. And I think it can be true sort of both directions, as you were just mentioning, Rebecca. And so again, increasing that, reducing some of sort of the jargon and some of the barriers to entry, and sort of the just emotional barrier that can exist, and sort of increasing the backgrounds that people have, so that they can weigh in on some of this stuff. So just wanted to add.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, really thinking about pathways into various career paths, not just pipelines, right? So the idea is not that you have to have just started earlier, gotten in and followed this linear, pipeline, but that there's so many ways in, because there's so many different skills and experiences that are needed. So I'd like to talk a little bit now about both technical mechanisms and policy mechanisms that can help improve cybersecurity and the trustworthiness of digital financial solutions. So Jaya, do you want to talk a bit about the technical mechanisms, and then I'll turn back to Taylor to say something about the policy mechanisms?
Yeah, so when I look specifically around gender, I think the biggest thing, we talked about all of this lack of access and this lack of equity and for women in this space. I think it really comes down to being able, women having a sort of strong digital identity. If we would have a technical solution, honestly, strong identities is going to be the basis of it. So I know that, we've had experiments in the past. I'm thinking specifically of telecom-oriented solutions, like, for example, M-Pesa, which was a Vodafone payment systems for mobile using prepaid top-up. Those kinds of accessibility options for women, we need to have much more of those kinds of things. And then I think it's not just about, making sure we have strong identities, but when we have technical measures, that we enable them by default in the very beginning as the initial entry point, and then have them enabled in the background. So now, for example, we have this inertia of getting people to turn on MFA. This inertia when we have, for example, the introduction of certificates for even websites. So the movements that we've seen, things like Let's Encrypt, to increase compatibility for SSL for everywhere. We need to really have those at the very beginning, design securely, and educate. I think what you guys just said about empowering women by making sure that they're included in a lot of the technological advancements they're going to take part of, that's got to be the way to go. Otherwise, we have it, but won't be used.
Yeah, great. Taylor, you want to expand on that with the policy side?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is a big focus of our cybersecurity capacity development and financial inclusion work stream, which I know Keith has mentioned, and Leslie's also been involved in some of those working group meetings. And I just wanted to, briefly profile a project that we've just started, which is a stakeholder mapping of 6 African countries: Cameroon, Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. And there we're really trying to get a better sense of some of those policy mechanisms, because I think there's a lot of sort of lesson that we've taken from the US and from Europe here, but I think there's also, it's really a two-way dialogue and thinking about actually when you look at countries that are leapfrogging, into digital financial services and sort of skipping some of the brick and mortar banking structures, there's actually different mechanisms that can be built, and we can actually think about building a system that's more inclusive and that's more, more secure, or at least is more resilient. And so one of the big questions we're looking at is really, who's being served by digital financial services, who's included and who's excluded, who should be addressing those risks, and what kind of systems should be built to address those risks. And then, a buzzword that we use a lot, capacity development. What does that actually look like? What do we mean by that? And where do we need to be increasing capacity? So I think, there are certainly technical solutions that are being pioneered in a lot of places, but there's also a lot of policy mechanisms that are also being pioneered to think about actually, okay, if we want to protect folks, but also increase their access and really just increase the inclusivity of the financial system, where do you work on actually expanding that access? Where do you work on increasing some policy levers to make that access more robust and more secure? So we're really excited to look at these 6 countries as a starting place to see sort of, how they're developing, and also, to understand the environment and how potentially can be built to be sort of more accessible.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Turning to the Q&A again, I'm going to ask this question from Patrick Slattery. So given the scale of the challenge, how do you best see academia, governments, and business working together to make advances? Anyone want to get us started on that?
I think we've kind of addressed some of this stuff already, right? We talked about this, but maybe I want to go like a little bit deeper beyond just women. We have a foundational problem in cybersecurity that we don't all work together. If you see the wrangling that's happening now between the tech sector and a lot of governments all over the world, that is so endemic to the world that we're living in now, that's got to change. And it's beyond women. It's for everyone. We need to have better cooperation and better understanding. And it comes to things that I think are basic that governments would disagree with, like don't screw around with our encryption. Stop trying to put backdoors all over the place. Make sure that we don't continuously escalate and say, when there's ransomware, don't harbor the criminals that are conducting these types of attacks, and make sure that if they are there, that you don't institute a hack back policy, because it's going to make it worse for everyone all over the planet. Because you can't actually identify an actual perpetrator just on a few pieces of IOC's indicators of compromise. So I think we need to fix those problems first before we actually go to that more meta level of how do we get everybody working together in a happy space for this specific gender issue.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, and I'm glad that you raised this before we finish the conversation, that it's not a country by country problem and solution, though that has to be done. It's how do you cross the same boundaries that the bits cross and that the laws cross, and it's just a huge challenge there. Anyone else want to? Yeah, go ahead, Leslie.
Maybe I'll chime in here. I pasted the news that just got announced yesterday. So have a look at it. The World Bank announced a new global fund on cybersecurity to bring about these kind of collaboration more systematically across border, like you said. especially in low and middle income countries on cybersecurity solutions to fund for maturity assessment, offer technical assistance, and support training capacity building in these countries. And I also want to mention some of the ones, because I work a lot in the East Asia Pacific region and a cluster of countries called ASEAN nations in Southeast Asia. And there are groupings of collaboration already happening with Interpol, national cybersecurity strategy, and helping countries develop those strategy. And also the knowledge that's learned from knowledge hubs like Singapore to help other countries that are more impacted, especially during COVID, to bring up these kind of digital literacy that Taylor talked about, but also bring knowledge on some of the latest news on cyber attacks in the region and sharing that among government agency. So I think those are very important practical examples that's happening in the real world for the collaboration at the regional level. Thank you.
Yeah, Jaya.
Yeah, super quick. You know, we didn't talk about it here, but I am incredibly fascinated by this idea about how do we leapfrog as women, you know, a lot of the traditional financial institution issues that we've had. And I'm really curious about the role that cryptocurrency has to play in this dynamic in general, because we're looking at access to technology. You see that women aren't huge adopters of this type of new stuff, that they do have concerns about security on cryptocurrency related ecosystem things like the wallets, the exchanges, et cetera. So, you know, how do you actually get them to use the thing if they can't pay for it in places and they don't, you know, they can use it for big transfers, but then what? So I'm wondering if we can think of a more equitable, fair system with cryptocurrencies, with this leapfrogging, that would be more female friendly in all its aspects. So I think it's more of a point to think about. I don't have an answer, but since we know that criminals are making use of it and hiding it behind it, I think why not also try to pluck the better benefits of it?
Yeah. And, you know, I think, you know, there's some evidence that when women adopt measures that give them better financial positions, families benefit. So there's really a lot of benefit to this. You know, maybe that's a place where sort of the education can be tied to help your families. And I'm going to kind of wrap the two remaining questions in the chat into one here. You know, so one is, what are good cyber hygiene for women users, and are things like gender neutral names a good idea, or, you know, like I was suggesting, maybe appealing to helping your families. And then maybe the more general version of the question is one here from Abdulrahim Kamal. Can you elaborate on obstacles in adopting EKYC, electronic know your customer, to widen financial inclusion in non-bank segments, especially illiterate people who aren't going to even be reading the messages that you send, whether to communicate or create practical awareness among unbanked segments, or to avoid fraud or exploitation for fraudsters to impersonate and steal the identities, and then specifically in Africa and emerging economies. So anyone who wants to touch on those, I think, you know, we've touched on segments of it, but if anyone wants to say more, Brencil.
Yeah. Let me assume I've understood the question. If there are any challenges to adopting eKYC, know your customers. Okay. So I think when you look at the capital and all that, people in the capital, this has actually been adopted. And when you look at the profile of organizations that are adopting eKYC, a majority of them are seeing a lot of value, but specifically from the city centers. However, when you look at our profile, a huge percentage of organizations are in the we call it mashinani, in the grassroots levels, and a lot of these people prefer to actually go to the physical bank and look at the person who is giving them. They want to see where the money is, where the money is sitting, and this presents a number of challenges. And also, when you're looking at eKYC, one of the things that you have to understand is that it means that the bank itself has to have a very good database and algorithms that would help it determine this is the person, this is the this is the person, we are tying this person to this account. So there's a lot of back end that they need to do in order for them not to be taking on too much risk. So the sanitization on the back end has not been done for it to be fully automated on the front end. So it would be such a high risk for an organization to fully automate its eKYC, and they haven't really done the back end, which they haven't. So that is one of the limitations. However, like I've said, there are a lot of top banks that have now adopted eKYC, especially even for granting of loans, even opening of accounts. But there is obviously that one last step where you have to go into that branch. And it's just because I think when you look at the profile of the threat landscape here in Africa, there are a number of things that come into play. Like I've said, back end and data consolidation is not as streamlined as you'd want it to be. So taking 100% automated processes becomes a big challenge. But also eKYC also means you have to integrate with other third parties in some instances. And one of the key challenges, if you read through some of the reports that we've been publishing, is that there's a lot of compromise. That's one of the target areas for a lot of attackers. So that has been some of the challenges why eKYC has not really been taken as a whole. However, like I've said, when you look at the trends, like what is coming up right now, even with the M-Pesa platform, it's now into an app. You don't need to go physically to a stall to transact. You don't need to go to a bank to withdraw or to even onboard, depending on what you're doing in terms of transactions. So we have adopted it to some extent, but we have to fix the back end first before we fully automate that process. I hope that answers.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So in the interest of time, I think we should move to starting to wrap up. And so I'd like to give each of our panelists a chance to give us some closing thoughts. Taylor, let's start with you.
Great, thanks so much. Sorry, my dog just photobombed me or Zoom bombed me a bit. She is antsy. It's really been lovely to be a part of this conversation, and I really enjoyed, for those of you who I didn't already know, getting a chance to meet you virtually here. Just a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think this conversation is really important, and there's so many different ways to come at some of these questions, from thinking about expanding pipelines and pathways into the cybersecurity workforce to actually protecting consumers and customers and increasing access. Just one other tool that I wanted to flag from Carnegie's perspective is we actually worked with the World Bank and the IMF and the Forum and a couple of other organizations to develop a capacity building toolbox specifically for smaller financial organizations. And I think it actually, can address organizations beyond the financial services industry. But the goal here was really to work on creating, a set of checklists and sort of guides that were specifically for organizations that don't have a lot of resources to invest in cybersecurity and are making a lot of tough choices about where to put personnel and money to actually improve security. And I think it links to some of the questions that we were just getting about know your customers and some of the other great tools that are out there need to be expanded. But I would really encourage anyone to take a look. We're working on an update as well, and we focus on ransomware, workforce development, as well as sort of from the board level down, how to actually increase cybersecurity awareness and resilience. And so I think there's a lot more conversations to be had here, but I would very much enjoy chatting more about this.
Great, thank you, Leslie.
Thank you so much, Professor Wright. I think we cover a lot of bases on this panel, and just echoing on the point that Taylor made on being on the board of director positions. I wanted to make sure that we always give a voice to the gender dimension and encouraging more women leadership to take part in decision-making process, and encouraging more focus on how to increase the cybersecurity posture of the organizations that we're serving. And out of that, we hope that over time, it will kind of create more women to participate in the labor force and transition and also apply some of the transferable skills that you mentioned in this discussion here on women in tech and then transferring into cybersecurity, or some cases, women who have focused a lot on the criminal law, identity, not just a technology background. So I think we have a long way to go, but raising the discourse in this kind of event is definitely a step in the right direction, and we look forward to more global collaboration. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Leslie. Jaya.
I'd like to close the way I started, talking about women as victims. I'd like to stop talking about women as victims. Look, attackers are always going to attack at the people and the places that are the most vulnerable. It's just a fact. So I think it's about us making women less vulnerable, more aware, more equipped to kind of deal with the threat. And that doesn't just come at addressing the problem for women, it comes at addressing the technical problem for everyone. And then making sure that that accessibility is driven to everybody and included for everyone. It's the only way where we are going to have a secure future. So I hope next time that we don't discuss this from a gender specific point of view.
Yeah, that's such an interesting kind of dichotomy that we live in, where right now you do need to separate and discuss specifically various kinds of populations that are not being properly served and represented. But the goal is that can't we just all be people and do things that are good for people? So I guess the optimists among us think we might get there, and all of us are working to try to do that in our own ways. Brencil, let's turn to you.
Okay. I think I'll borrow what Jaya said, and she talked about fundamentals. And when she mentioned that, I think it hit me differently. And I'll also borrow from what she said, like we should talk about it. Like let's not talk about women being the victims. So with those two in mind, one of the things that I do, I do different things. So on a normal day, sometimes I do handle a lot of forensic investigations and in financial institutions. And one of the things I've noticed is that at the end of the day, the client wants answers, and they want you to help them stop the problem, regardless of whether you're a man or you're a woman. So at that specific point, when they're in need, they want someone who can offer them solutions. And a lot of the time, which now ties into the fundamentals discussion that Jaya brought about, is that whenever we fix a discussion to just focus on one aspect, we tend to miss out on the fundamentals. And for the ladies who are listening, the goal is not just to get women in cyber. The goal is to get women who can fix the issues that are around cybersecurity. So with the fundamental knowledge, so not just to increase our numbers, but really to solve a problem that is bothering a lot of organizations. When you look at all the reports, we say insider threat is a top issue, endpoint security, application. There are so many issues that we say we want to fix. So the big thing is that I would encourage a lot of us to just focus on the fundamentals. And I was having a discussion with a few of my colleagues whereby right now, if you look online, there are a lot of women in cybersecurity awards, top woman awards. So there are all these awards for women, which is very good. But then the problem might be, I also have one. So I'm also a victim, yes. But the problem sometimes can be, it makes us shift the focus from actually focusing on the fundamentals. What are the skills that we need to have to solve this problem? So I would actually encourage us to not lose sight of the ball. Let's focus on the fundamentals. We need to work equally as hard as everyone else who is working in this space to fix the issues around cybersecurity. And for those ones who are not sure where they need to start from, I have been doing research for the last 5 years, and the issues change, but they don't really change. It's the same issue we keep talking about. So I would encourage, let's look at those problems and let's solve them for the continent, for the world. And I think that would be a good place. Yeah, so thank you.
Great, thank you. What an excellent place to leave it. Thank you to our panelists, Leslie Go, Jaya Baloo, Brencil Kaimba, and Taylor Grossman for this insightful conversation. Thank you to the conference organizers for putting this together, and of course to the participants for coming and for your questions. And Michael, I'll turn it back to you.
Dr. Wright and our panel, thank you so much for really an exhilarating hour. I really enjoyed it. I wish we could continue, and hopefully again another time. We're going to go ahead and move to our next panel right now, and I hope all of you stay with us in our transition, which is going to be Trends, Initiatives, and Innovation in Cybersecurity and DFS, the Pandemic and Beyond.